So in Canada, there has been extensive research on youth homelessness. However, issues regarding LGBTQ youth are often an add-on or an afterthought, and rarely the focus of studies. So there's actually very little that we know in Canada about queer and trans youth homelessness. What we do know, however, is that LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in the homeless youth population, but underrepresented in homeless shelters. So we know that approximately 25 to 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ in Canada. However, this statistic came from one study approximately 14 years ago. So there's not very much understanding or clarity what that number actually looks like today, or how we even begin to scale the problem of LGBTQ youth homelessness, because shelters rarely collect data on youth's LGBTQ identities. Today, there is an increase in the numbers of LGBTQ youth who are homeless, which is interesting because we're also becoming a more accepting society, right? And so a lot of LGBTQ people will migrate to Toronto with the hopes of, finding support and acceptance. However, on the flip side, we have such a high rate of LGBTQ youth who experience homelessness. And I think this is really due to a lack of awareness, a lack of education, and really a lack of understanding of the complexities that exist between coming out and homelessness, and the relationship between coming out and homelessness, and how often coming out actually leads to homelessness. So we know that trans youth face higher amounts of discrimination than any other youth group in the shelter system. And this is widely due to a lack of trans awareness amongst shelter workers, and a lack of training around LGBTQ youth, but more specifically around the needs of trans youth. So for this reason, trans youth often avoid the shelter system altogether. We know that the culture of the shelter system is a normalized homophobia and transphobia, so it's really an atmosphere of oppression. And so therefore, LGBTQ youth don't feel safe due to homophobia and transphobia. We also know that institutional erasure occurs quite often. So by institutional erasure, I mean that the institution actually erases LGBTQ youth from existence. So for example, by not recording and not including people's identity. So just say you have an intake form which only has the option to fill out male or female. Any identity that doesn't fall into the male or female category is not collected. And if it's not collected, then it's seen to not exist. And if it doesn't exist, then there's no need for specialized services. So this is how the institution actually erases LGBTQ youth from existence quite often. For over 2 decades, we have known that the shelter system is not safe for LGBTQ youth, but still very little has been done to make it any safer for queer and trans youth. So that's why, LGBTQ youth often avoid the shelter system. We know that LGBTQ youth often find parks and alleyways safer than the actual shelter system, which is highly problematic. There's also very little specialized support in Canada for queer and trans youth. So even though we know all of these problems, there are no specialized housing initiatives that meet the needs of LGBTQ youth in Canada, which is something that has been a very successful model in the States, for example.